Hello. Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Okay, so let's get started, right? I guess we have a few seconds. Let me share my screen, get the logistics out of the way. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we could get started. Um, and Can you see the presentation screen now? Because I'm not sure with the Zoom. Um,
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
okay. Um, so if you have a question at any point during the presentation, please just just let me know, or put it in the chat screen or something. I'll try to check it frequently and answer the questions as we go along. But so today I'm talking about conducting and writing a literature review. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Omar Basha. I'm an assistant professor in the chemical engineering department, um, and I work primarily in multi-phase flows and multi-phase reactive flows pertinent to chemical engineering. Let me close this. Okay. So before we start talking about the specifics of a literature review, let's just have a look generally at a research study. So most of you are graduate students or taking part in research of some sort, and when writing your manuscript, writing your thesis, dissertation, whatever it is, it usually follows a certain structure, which looks like this. You need your abstract title, of course, your abstract, and then you have a section which has your reflective inquiry, which is the story which leads to your big question, right? Or the question you want to investigate. And this typically involves a problem statement. So usually start off by saying, for example, we have some limitations in measuring this parameter. And so in this work, I want to have a look at how to do it. And in order to justify this problem statement, you need to make a review of the literature, which is what have other people done. Because there are millions of people doing research out there, thousands of universities, everyone is working on stuff, and it's always better as a researcher to try and complement or build on other people's work rather than just merely replicating them. You always want to add value as a researcher, because this is the ultimate goal of your work, or of your mission, basically. And the literature review is arguably um, the most critical part to correctly start your research. You need to be aware of what's going on before dipping in with your opinion and works, right? So this is what we'll be talking about today, literature review. So a lot of times when you're being asked to write a literature review, when discussing with your group, discussing with your advisor, maybe you present at a conference, these are very common types of questions. What does the literature show us, how about you connect your ideas or your work, or to the literature? you know Maybe you should have a look at what other people did first before you continue moving on in this direction. And these are very common themes in research. And you might ask yourself, what is the literature really? What does the literature mean? This is the first point for you. So literature is basically the published record of the research that has been done in the field, right? So And most common way in academia is research journals, right? So ACS, Science Direct, any other research journal, these are typically referred to as the literature. If you work in industry, literature typically refers to manuals, white papers, industrial reports, that type of thing. And typically literature, they have a chain between them. There's a thread of thought where, you know, someone starts something and then people keep on building on this idea to try and develop it, try and push the boundaries of the science. And most of the literature is indexed and searchable using library databases. Google Scholar is the most common one recently. It's a very powerful tool to use, and it can usually give you access to patents, to like obscure conferences, all types of journals. And most of the time, after you find something in Google Scholar, you need to use a paid library subscription, which is usually your university subscription, to be able to download this paper. So if you try and download it from home, for example, sometimes it tells you.
Doing good. How are you?
So if you try, sorry, may you please mute yourselves? If you try to access a paper from home, for example, ask you to pay for it, and you know, you don't really have to. You can just use a VPN and connect to your to the university. Okay, so generally in almost any scientific field, this is the architecture of the scientific literature, right? You always have the major works. These are the landmark pieces of work. In my field, for example, they're usually very old papers, maybe in the 1960s, where they were the first people who asked the question. They were the first people who collected some data and established some trends. And in almost any field, you have these types of things. You have your major works, important papers, very highly cited, very well written usually. So when you read them, they're very easy to read, that type of thing. And then you have the studies which rely on the major works, right? So you always have small studies. So for example, major work by Professor A, let's say he's in Japan, you have a bunch of papers from his students, his collaborators in Japan, maybe in the US and Europe, who have like, who try to replicate, improve that type of thing. And then other people who try to take it on a tangent, try and push it forward, etc. And then eventually you have this box tier D, and this is where you want to be, right? This is the new major work. This is what you want to do, right? You want to always build on the major works and try to do something new, try to do it in a way which connects all of these ideas without actually omitting one of them, or without going in a direction that someone has already done before and end up just replicating a work and maybe wasting your time. And this is really the general architecture of any field in science or engineering in general. So what's the purpose? So why do you need to write a literature review? I mean, what's the point? So the point is you need to place your problem in the context of known knowledge, right? So the problem you're trying to address, the hypotheses you have, you need to make sure that it's a valid hypothesis, that it's relevant, that based on the previous work, someone cares about it besides you, of course, and that is going to add to the field, right? And you need to identify variables that previous studies found either important or unimportant. Because a lot of times you get an idea, you're excited about it, you want to measure something in the lab, and then you find out that, you know, there are 10 papers in the literature which measured it and found out that it's pointless, right? Or it's been beaten to death, you know, like there are hundreds of correlations, thousands of data points already available in the literature. And ultimately, the third point is that you want to suggest factors to consider in setting the research design and methodology. So especially if in engineering or science, you want to, in your thesis, after your introduction and background, you have to write your methodology, right? And your methodology has to be based on sound scientific methods, right? Sound scientific methodology. And this is very important. And the only way to identify the variables which are relevant, the conditions which are relevant, the ranges which are relevant, you need to have a look at the literature and have a good understanding of what's going on. So for example, let's say you want to measure mass transfer of carbon dioxide in water, for example, for a wastewater treatment plant, right? So you really, and you want to do some experiments. So at what temperatures are you going to do these experiments? Over what range of pressures? Over what ranges of flow rates? Over what ranges of concentrations, right? For you to be able to properly design your experiment in a good, valid scientific way, which will help you get reasonable results and useful data, you need to have an idea of what's been done before, and what to look out for when preparing your work. Okay. And it's also important to understand that a literature review is not just a summary of what has been done before. And this is a very common tangent which a lot of early stage researchers, especially master's students, PhD students, go into. It should not be a list of, this guy did this, this guy did this, this guy did this. This is not the purpose of a literature review. And you should not think of a literature review as a chore where, oh, I just need to get it out of the way to, write my 10 pages and, shove it in the face of my advisor and move on with my life. No, yeah, it has to add value to your work, okay? It's a conceptual framework which presents your own understanding of the literature and how it relates to the work you're proposing to do. And this is extremely important to understand and realize, okay? When preparing your literature review, you need to think beyond just, oh, this guy did this, this guy did this, this guy did this. You want to understand the full story, right? You understand all the parameters, understand the characters, and build your own, the validity of your own hypothesis within that context. So it also serves to show, so literature review portion is also important because it shows that you have some knowledge of the topic and the field, right? So usually when you write your thesis or you write your manuscript, you're presenting it to professors who are experts in their field, or at least have um, a good knowledge of the field. So you need to show them that, you've done your homework, you know what's going on. And you also need to make sure that this has not been done before. The worst thing you could do is do a bunch of experiments, spend months in the lab measuring everything, and then after you present it, the first comment is, well, it's been done 40 years ago and he collected better data than you. It just shows that you haven't done your homework and you just ended up wasting time and resources. And it also helps you direct your direction to future research, right? Keeping updated with the past literature, the current literature, will help you guide you to what's everyone doing. Where's this field going to? What should I learn to help improve myself as a researcher, help guide my direction, and that sort of thing. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a good literature review? And this is just a thought, keep in mind while we start talking in more details. Your literature review should never list, right? It should always describe what other people have done. It should synthesize some conclusions, some relationships between the parameters which have been investigated. You should always be able to critique a piece of work. And if you have a journal club or something, this is a very good opportunity to practice it. If you're not part of a journal club, it's always good to join with your graduate students or something and try to have a journal club where everyone takes a short paper, reads it over a week, and then critique it. And a critique is not a criticism, right? So a critique, say you read a paper and you critique it, you shouldn't say, oh, his introduction is too short, or he has too many spelling errors or something. A critique should have a scientific basis. So for example, would be, why did he do his experiments over a temperature range from 300 to 350, and he disregarded 350 to 375 when important phenomena have been observed to occur in 350 to 375. That sort of thing. A critique has to be based on a scientific basis and help you come up with new questions for your research, right? And then a literature review should be clear in showing the story of your work. So in reading your thesis, reading your dissertation, after going through the literature review, after seeing all your critiques, all your opinions, your links of all the previous work, I should be able to see that, okay, I see his story now, I see where it's leading to, and I see that he has a question, a genuine, valid question, which he's going to investigate. A literature review should also have breadth and depth. So this means it should not just be a very narrow literature review. It should not be superficial, where you just say authors A to Z, and you just stick them all in reference 1 to 26, investigated this topic. No, it needs to have some detail. And it shouldn't have an overkill of detail, because, you know, this is also another thing some researchers struggle with, is you write the term in Google Scholar, you get 100,000 results, you download the first paper, it's 60 pages, and it starts becoming a nightmare, right? How am I going to read all of this stuff? How am I going to deal with all this information? No, you need to be able to boil down and just identify the important piece of work. We're going to get to this in a second. It should cover all aspects relevant to your topic, and by topic, I mean the specific point which you're investigating, not your general topic. So for example, if you're looking at mass transfer rate of calcium between cells and between neurons, for example, your literature review should not focus on the entire nervous system. It should just focus on calcium mass transfer in neurons, or maybe ion mass transfer between neurons, something like that. Just keep it focused, but keep it general. So if I only look at this specific topic, you'll find out that maybe there's 6, 7 important researchers. They have maybe 30 papers between them. This is my body of work, which I'm going to look at, which I'm going to try to summarize, investigate, etc. And the last point is not very common for early stage researchers, but as you progress through your career, you'll find out that you'll find out that, you'll run into it more. If you don't find any literature, you Google it, there's nothing out there, then you need to start thinking on how are you going to break into this new area. And by breaking into a new area, you can't just, punch in the dark. You need to carefully plan based on what other people have done in sort of parallel areas, right? So if you want to plan some experiments, you need to have a logic or a chain of logic in planning these experiments. If you want to build a model, you need to also have some logic when building or designing this model as well. Okay, so any questions so far? Let's stop here. If you have any questions, just please let me know. Okay. So let's keep moving. So this is an overview of the literature review process. Usually, when you join a group, you have a topic. Sometimes you don't, but most of the time your advisor will tell you, we're doing research in area A. You start collecting information, typically information from your lab mates. Maybe someone previously in the group published a paper. You'll have a look at the experiments. You're starting to aggregate some information. And then you start Googling, looking through Science Direct, looking through ACS, trying to get papers and download papers. And then reading the articles is usually the hard part, right? You need to analyze articles, you need to synthesize information, extract information into conceptual frameworks, and then you need to write and revise papers. So always, whenever you read an article which you think is important, try to jot down these notes somewhere so that you don't end up forgetting it, or you don't end up overlooking it, because a research project usually carries over a period of 2 years, maybe 4 years, and you always need to try and iterate and remember what you're doing. And reading articles is by far the most important part of doing a literature review. And you always need to remember that when doing literature review, you have to read. Okay, there is no way around it. If you don't read, you'll never learn. Very basic, simple correlation. If the literature is too dense, too hard to break down, unfortunately, this is the situation you have to deal with. You have to try and read it, fight through it, and eventually it will get easier. But reading is the most critical thing you'll do as a researcher. And reading is a skill. Most people who just started research might not have this skill, might not be necessarily good at this skill, but it is probably the most important skill you'll need as a researcher as you progress through your graduate studies if you end up in academia. Reading is critical. You need to always read. I can't emphasize this enough, okay? Just read, okay? So going back, what are the components of a literature review? Usually literature review as a section in your thesis will have an introduction, and an introduction just provides context. So for example, if you're talking about natural gas, you'll say, natural gas is an important commodity. The biggest producer of natural gas are maybe Iran, Russia, Qatar. You have natural gas reserves. It's primarily sold in A, B, and C, and the market is growing. Just a general introduction. There's nothing technical about the topic. I'm not really talking about any specifics of the catalyst, of the reactor, of whatever it is, just a general context giving introduction. The second part should give you an overview of the key concepts and important papers. So then after that, you could say, natural gas, despite its importance, has some drawbacks where, liquefying it takes a lot of energy, all of this stuff. And this guy in 1998 said that, there are opportunities, but no one has done anything. And this other guy measured this property of this parameter, but no one has done anything. And as you can see, as you're starting to give overview of key concepts, you're moving into part 3, which is the discussion of the critical gaps and disagreements in the literature, right? So now, this guy, they have 3 researchers, they all measured it and they have conflicting results. And this could be because, their equipment was old or something. And so the purpose of this, my work, is to A, B, and C. So after you're done with these 3 points, you're building into your own work, building into your own objective, into your own logic and what you want to do. And models, so there are 2 general models for writing a literature review. The first one is the stringing model. And unfortunately, this is not uncommon. You still see this quite a bit. It's the wrong way to do things. You have to understand that if you read your literature review and it looks like this, it's you need to revise it. Simple as, right? Stringing model, you have your introduction, and then paragraph 1 is summary of article 1, summary of article 2, summary of article 3, and it just ends up being a list. And this is not a good model to use. You try to avoid it. It takes effort to avoid doing this type of thing, and following this model might be a good idea as a first draft. So for example, you're just starting, it might be a good idea to have this type of model as a first draft. You're reading papers 1 by 1 and you're summarizing them 1 by 1, but this should not be the final meal you present, right? What you need to present should look more like the synthesis model on the right here, where you need to try to combine or categorize it into themes. So in the synthesis model, your introduction will have context, topic, importance, etc. And then you start looking at the 3 or 4 most important themes, right? So for example, if let's say you're investigating catalysts in a reactor, for example. So theme 1 would be maybe catalyst stability. You're gonna say, authors A, B, and C looked at catalyst stability. They found out that this guy found out that catalyst is stable in between these ranges. However, this disagrees with the other guy, and this could potentially be due to the nature of the material or could be to this or that. Theme B could, for example, be catalyst attrition, for example. Catalyst attrition is a big problem. It's been reported. Bunch of researchers looked at it and they found out that catalyst attrition typically falls between these ranges. However, these were measured under conditions which are not realistic. Something like that. So you need to organize your ideas into themes and be able to link the different works within each theme. And this will really help you identify the path forward, will give you a stronger feel for what you're doing, and it will help you avoid overlooking important points or important topics. So this is very important. And then your final paragraph should always summarize, highlight conclusions, highlight unresolved issues, or typically referred to as technology gaps. And then you need to identify possible next steps. And possible next steps, in the best way possible, in a very ideal scenario, have to be measurable metrics, right? So possible next steps would be, I want to minimize my catalyst attrition from maybe 45% to 15%. I want to do this. You need to have measurable metrics, but however, most of the time, this is not very possible, or you might not be able to achieve this. So you could have your possible next steps as general statements, optimize, enhance catalyst performance, or optimize reactor performance, very general statements. And this is what you commonly see in the literature. So is there a step-by-step process to follow? It's your typical cycle. You need to read, you need to write, you need to revise, right? This is how it goes in research or in doing your literature review. Again, reading is the most important, the most critical step you will do, okay? Reading is hard. It might be annoying. You might not have the patience to, read through 10 pages, 15 pages of work. You might read the first paragraph, find out that the terms are so complex. I don't have a clue what was this guy talking about. This is all very common, okay? It has nothing to do with you. If you see this, you're not dumb or anything. This is very, very common. Everyone goes through this. Just fight through this. Push yourself to read, because if you don't read, you'll never learn. Very simple correlation. Again, after you read, try to write. Try to summarize, have a notebook, or maybe if you're printing out the papers, try to add some very brief notes in the margins. There are some softwares which aggregate and do that. I think one of them was called ReadCube, for example. It's a very common software to do that. Where ReadCube will help you maybe, aggregate your papers, organize them, and then you can add notes in the margins and things like that. Mendeley also helps you do that, or you can do it in Word, you can maybe PDF sometimes. Adobe Acrobat has that facility. And then after you do that, maybe every once in a while, let's say every 6 months or every year, whenever you have to present a conference, or whenever you have to write a paper, or whenever you have to submit an updated draft of your thesis, you should be able to look back at all these papers and not read them from scratch, right? Just you start reading them, maybe read one or two, the important ones, but you shouldn't read all of them from scratch when you have a deadline. You should have good enough notes where you're able now to see the thread of thought, see the themes, and write them in a good way. And then you have to iterate all of this. So this is an iterative process. Your first draft or your first read will never be the final one. You have to do this maybe 3, 4, be prepared to even do it 7, 8 times. This is how it is. This is how you become a good researcher. You need to put standards, quality standards for yourself. You need to have the dedication to do it and the patience to do it. Also very important. So when reading, you need to read synthetically, right? And you're not reading, and this is different than reading, an article on the internet or something. You need to read with your brain present, Don't just, your eyes are reading and your brain is somewhere else. So it's not going to work out, right? You need to identify major themes or concepts in the literature. So while you're reading, keep an eye out for what's going on. So let's say you read 3 papers and all 3 investigators now have mentioned maybe the effect of high temperature. Okay, write it down. That type of thing. Classify papers or paper sections by topic, method, theme. So let's say you're doing an experimental investigation and you read 10 papers, 3 papers followed this experimental method A, 3 papers followed experimental method B. Maybe it's a good idea to classify them and see how the results are different. You know, maybe the difference in results is due to the experimental method. It's a very clear delineation for you to do. Compare and contrast papers, right? What's the relationship between the sources? So a lot of times, especially in experimental work, you'll have a bunch of people doing the same thing and publishing the same thing. And many times, unfortunately, they don't get the same result, right? So you need to have a look at all these papers, see what's going on. Why do you think they're different? Or what's the relationship between these works? Where are the disagreements? What work has to be done to reconcile or verify or etc. And then the final point is you need to outline your conceptual framework. A lot of the time when you start doing research, you don't really know the specific hypotheses, and coming up with a hypothesis can seem like impossible if you're starting. But as you read more, as you get a better understanding of the themes, of the connections, you will start seeing the gaps, right? You will start seeing that, oh, there's this big area which no one looked at, or there's this big relationship, or this big property which no one measured. But in order to achieve this, you need to read, and you need to read efficiently. There are tools out there. This is one tool which I've seen people use before, and they say it's been somewhat successful for them. And it's up to you. You know, some people are very organized workers. Some people are somewhat chaotic workers, let's say, and it's really up to you. If you put it in a table, it helps, where you basically list the authors and you list all the themes you've seen, and you just write a small comment and create sort of a synthesis matrix. I like using this, especially when I have a short deadline and I need to write a paper, a presentation, a manuscript. However, I always use this technique as a second step, where the first step I aggregate the papers, read them, and write short notes or short summaries. Then I have a second step where I build a synthesis matrix. So it's really up to you. And you're going to refine this skill or what works for you better as you move along with your research. So some tips on writing: don't wait until you finish searching the literature. Write your thoughts as you read. This is very important. Maybe write your thoughts. I've seen people record their thoughts as voice messages, just whatever works for you. Just have a track record of what you've been doing. Because if you read 10 papers, let's say in a week, and then 4 months later you have to write a paper, you'll end up having to read all of them again. This is going to end up exhausting a lot of your time. Start with the easier sections, right? So a lot of times you open a paper and the abstract is different language. I don't know what's going on. What the hell is this, right? Maybe you just move on to methods where the section is easier, or move on to results, maybe where you can see the graph and you can see the author's explanation of the graph, and you can start, oh, okay, I see what he's doing then. So when reading a paper, especially dense ones, it's always a good idea to start with the easier sections, and then you can move back to the introduction and try to make it all fit together. Take detailed notes, right? So when writing notes, don't scribble notes, don't write notes which a week from now you'll have no clue what you're talking about. Make the notes good enough such that you can always understand them when you revisit them. Okay, and this is very important, right? Don't waste your effort. Don't waste your time and effort you put in collecting information, reading information. Always try to push forward by being efficient. Get feedback. Don't take it too personally. This is also a thing with early career researchers, master students, graduate students. Don't take it personally, okay? If you write a thesis, you give it to your advisor. You write a presentation, you give it to your advisor, and they come back saying, it's not good enough, or why did you look at this? Why did you do this? Maybe this is not the right approach. Don't take it personally. Don't make it affect you in a personal way. And I have a long face. You go home, you're sad about it. It's fine. This is normal in the process. You just need to keep pushing forward, keep thinking this is very normal. Feedback, especially, and if you end up in academia, you need to get used to people giving you nasty feedback, right? It seems to be a thread in about 15% of academics, right? So, people will be mean to you. People will tell you, this work is useless, whatever. It's fine. Don't take it personally. Just keep working on what you want, what you like. Keep reading, keep improving, and move forward. When writing, also aim for a style that's clear, simple, and straightforward. And this is very important, especially for both native speakers and non-native speakers of the language. First of all, never write the same way as you talk, right? When you're writing, it's not a text message. It's not, you don't write the same way as you're speaking, for example. Your sentences have to be short. They have to have an objective, and they have to be to the point, right? So work on your writing. It's a skill you need to practice. Maybe you need to revise multiple drafts, but writing correctly or writing in a good way is an important skill. Keep your sentence, again, for me, for example, the most important advice I would give to my students is keep your sentences short to the point. Avoid having sentences which go on for 5 lines, for example. It's not good. Revise it, make it short, explain your idea in short, quick points. Okay, now let's go to reading. Some tips on reading. Having a thorough literature review is important. However, you should not waste significant time reading prior research, right? Let's say you're doing a master's degree. You only have maybe 2 years, a year and a half. You shouldn't waste 6 months reading literature, right? This is a waste of time. Engage in pre-reading, reading, and post-reading, right? So get comfortable reading a paper more than once. And even though you download 100 papers or 50 papers, 20 papers, whatever, just be prepared that you're going to do a pre-reading step where you're going to focus on the title, abstract, and main headings, okay? And then you need to ask yourself a question. Is this report or is this manuscript good enough for my work? Is it going to add anything for my work, or can I just overlook it? And start filtering, start narrowing down the pool of important papers to maybe 10, 15 papers. These will always be your go-to. These will be the inspiration for your work, or the starting point for your review. After pre-reading, you start reading, right? You start focusing on the relative parts of the manuscript. So you're going to start, so now I downloaded 30 papers, or I Googled and searched in Google Scholar. I found these papers. I had a look at the abstract, I filtered them out. Now I have 15 papers. I'm going to focus on the relevant parts. I'm going to look at the methodology. Is this guy doing his experiments in the same ranges I'm interested in? Is he actually measuring parameters which I'm interested in? Start reading these parts, start identifying the themes, all of this stuff. And then post-reading is, now you read the paper, let's write a short summary, let's make some notes, let's fill in the synthesis matrix or the reading matrix, and let's basically take our notes and move on to the next paper, whatever it is. And finally, similar to the previous slide, always organize your notes. It's very important to have organized notes. When writing down notes, make sure you're able to revisit them and understand them later on. Try to have a logical style of writing notes. So for example, maybe you could say title, you could write your notes in maybe 4 bullets, author, year, parameters measured, results, Is it relevant? Yes, no, something like that. Just try to keep your notes organized, easy to revisit, easy to understand. Okay. Typical questions, very typical questions. How do I know when I have found enough information? How do I know when I have done a thorough review of the major works on a topic? Is 30 papers enough? Is 15 pages written down enough? How do I know when to stop? And in order to do that, you need to try to find books, okay? A book will always give you a short, better overview of the work cited or of the research work, okay? And this will help you answer these questions. Have I done enough literature review? And there are a lot of books out there covering research topics, especially in engineering, also in chemistry and physics and these types of areas. There are always books talking about the important parameters, the relationships, etc. So I recommend that your starting point of a literature review should always start with books, and then you move on to, before books, of course, your notes, your science, what you learned as an undergrad. You need to make sure you're comfortable with that, and then you move on to research books, and then you move on to research papers, right? When searching, and then second point is when searching in Google Scholar or Web of Science or whatever, avoid putting in very general terms, right? Avoid saying, for example, cobalt catalysts. This is a very general term. You're gonna get 5 million results or something like that, and you're just gonna end up, lost at sea, Try to narrow it down to important terms. So for example, cobalt catalyst attrition, high temperature, Fischer-Tropsch reactor, something like that. And then try to identify the good 30 relevant results which you think are useful. And then as you start looking through the papers, maybe try to find out a few more search terms which will help you narrow it down further, etc., etc. So when collecting information, try to collect information in a good, efficient way. And Google Scholar, Web of Science are also very good sources. And talk to your advisor. This is very, very important, okay? Share your list of references and get his feedback or her feedback, because your advisor will most likely have an idea, has been exposed to the field before, and he will know that if he sees your list of references and you missed an important paper, he'll direct you towards it, that type of things. And of course, since you're in a research group, you're in a team, make sure to include your advisor's work, right? So if you're joining a group and you're doing a literature review and then you go to your advisor, he told you, but the student before you already did it, it's you need to, it just shows that you haven't done your homework properly, right? So and it's important to always talk to your advisor, maybe not keep a good relationship because who knows, there are many people out there, different personalities, but always try to keep a continuous conversation with your advisor, feedback loop going with your group, engage with them, etc. Okay, so what's the best way, also common questions, what's the best way to keep your references organized? Is there a software to help you with the process? There are software to help you with your process. You have, you could always save searches. So in Google, you can save searches, you can set up alerts, etc. You should always get the complete citation information. So sometimes when using Google Scholar, especially, it will give you missing citation information. Try to fill in the gaps of your reference citation. Use a writing system that helps you avoid inadvertent plagiarism, okay? So this goes back to taking notes. When taking notes, so for example, if you're taking notes in a Word document, avoid copying paragraphs from a paper, because when you revisit your notes, you might not remember that you actually copied this paragraph and you might end up plagiarizing someone else's work. And to answer the question, yes, there are software which will help you aggregate these, such as EndNotes, Mendeley, RefWorks, or Zotero. Learn to use them, okay? It's really that simple. EndNotes and Mendeley, I've used them. They're very, very good. I personally prefer EndNotes. It's a very good tool to aggregate all your references, aggregate all your citations, and it also helps you insert them into a Word document, into LaTeX, into a manuscript, and keep track of all your work. I know the university does have a license for EndNotes. Mendeley is open access, it's free, so you can download it. Try to find one of these two, download them, use them, get comfortable with them. Extremely important tool, especially if you want to continue in academia or in a research setting. Okay, so this brings me to the end of this presentation. I'll open the floor for a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so if no one has any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. My email is ombasha.
Hi, excuse me.
Yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Tell me.
I'm sorry. I was wondering, I do appreciate the matrix that you shared with us about the concepts and the authors. I think that's really good. I've only written one lit review and I formulated it along that matrix, so that was great. My question is, do you have any tips for how we can avoid merely listing and summarizing what authors have done versus really having that strong discussion aspect? Any tips or guidance?
Yeah, my tip would is be comfortable reiterating and rewriting drafts, because your first read will always be a list. And this is natural because when you're reading, you're trying to process a lot of information. It's logically and naturally, you'll put them in a list, right? It's the most logical way to do it, and it's normal. So your first draft will always be a list, but then when you revisit this, when you come and revisit it again, try to connect your parts of your list. So connect items of your list and aggregate them into themes. And then try to compare and contrast the different papers within each theme. And this will start building your discussion. Okay, so this is how it really works. Again, don't get frustrated with reiterating, rewriting your literature review, but this is how you have to do it in order to get a good piece of work at the end. Okay, so yeah, writing a list initially and taking good notes in this list initially is a very good idea, but then it's always good to revisit and combine your list components into themes. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And I do appreciate what you said about the first reading is more of a list, that use that second and third readings to kind of keep aggregating and comparing. My next question, if you don't mind, is you mentioned the citation management systems. What's your opinion of Perla?
I haven't really used it. I used EndNotes and Mendeley, and I understand that different fields will have their own, let's say, conventional software they use. In engineering, for example, EndNotes is very common, and a lot of the people I collaborate with, they use EndNotes, so it makes it easier to send them a paper and then they can add the references, that type of thing. Most of the time they could, sort of import, export from each other, but it's always good to try and use a software which is not too obscure, So if that software is common in your field, in the circle of researchers you're dealing with, go ahead and use it. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yes.
Dr. Bashir, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Please, I'd like to know, sometimes when I'm trying to cite someone or a paper that I've read, it's hard to tell, okay, what do you not cite? What do you consider general knowledge? And there's a temptation to cite every sentence or every, single statement that you make? When do you tell that this statement is kind of common knowledge or this should be cited?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. It's always good practice to, if you take a piece of information from a source, just cite the source, okay? Just cover your back. It's always the best way to move forward. That's why it's always good when starting your literature review is to start with a book, right? And a book will usually have most of the general knowledge information. So if you have a lot of pieces of general knowledge scattered throughout your manuscript, you don't have to have 100 different citations. Just cite this book in all these places, and this way you covered yourself. Yeah, when you write a short paper and you have 80 references, it's not good practice to have a short paper and lots of references. That's why you always start your literature review with an important source. And usually every field or subfield has a landmark book, which is used, for example, in your undergraduate studies or your graduate studies. Have a look at this book and cite it in all the areas which you feel are the general knowledge areas. Any other questions? And yes, someone asked in the chat about the presentation. I will provide a copy of the presentation to Miss Ayana Boyd Williams, and I'll ask her to share it with all of you.
Hello, Dr. Basha.
Hi.
It's me, Rabi, and thank you for your nice presentations, especially about literature writing. So I have a question about that. If I take any citation from a book, so do I need to specify the page number from where I have taken information, or I don't need to specify that page number?
So this will depend on the style, right, or on the journal. Some journals will ask you to specify the page number. Some journals will not. But it's always, so for example, if you're using, and sometimes if you have a big book and you're citing it 50 times, it's gonna be, it's not easy to try and find every page, right? As a general base practice, I wouldn't list the page numbers, but you have to be prepared that if the journal asks you to do it, you might have to, right?
Okay. I have another question.
Yes.
I can see that different writers like to structure their literature serving different ways. For example, somebody likes to start at first talking about the applications of their theory, then talk about the existing literature, that how other researchers come up with the problem and what is their proposed approaches and what are the limitations, and then they talk about our contributions, I mean the writer's contributions, and finally they talk about the organizations. On the other hand, some of the researchers come up with at first discussing the existing literature of art, then talk about some others problem, and finally talk about their contributions. So I would like to know from you that which one is the best practice?
The best practice is to try and basically give a general overview and then talk about specifics of the previous work and then introduce the hypothesis. However, there are a lot of different writers will have their own style and because at the end of the day, you're telling a story, right? And, just like when you're talking to people, different people will tell you stories in different ways, And as you get comfortable writing or as you write more papers, eventually you'll develop your own storytelling style. Okay, but as a beginning or as a starting point, I believe that you should always follow the standard or the safe option of having a general overview, talking about specific themes in the topic you're talking about, and then introducing your hypothesis and work.
Okay, and I have last questions. This question is relevant to my previous question that I can see that there are two types of writings. One of the writings in their organogram of the paper, at first they talk about introduction, then make another specific section from literature survey or something just like that. But some other papers, especially we can see in conference papers, they merge introduction and literature survey. So so what we have discussed in the previous case, if we merge introductions and literature together, in that case, do we need to talk about that, especially that which area we are talking, then come up with our existing literature of art, their problems, their procedures, and talk about mine? Or we can use this approach for both of the cases. I mean, if we separately discuss about introductions and talk something about in my literature uh, headings, what is the problems we are talking about, and talk about our existing literature for art. So
Okay. Yeah, so this depends. So he was asking about whether, so sometimes you have an introduction and background section, big
yes.
lump. Sometimes you have introduction by itself, background or literature review by itself. So again, if you have them as one big lump, you just follow the logic we talked about. If you have them separate, usually at the end of the introduction, you need to mention, so, and the objective of this work is A, B, and C, right? And then your literature review will be, will basically go back to the last sentence or highlight this last sentence of the introduction by identifying the technology gaps which makes your work relevant, right? So logically, if you have an introduction as a separate section, introduction will contain general information about the topic, about briefly what's been done, what hasn't been done, and then you're gonna say, therefore, there's a clear need to do A, B, and C, and this is what we're gonna do this in this work. And then second section, literature review, you're gonna talk about the themes. So, you know, the reason there's a gap in this work is because, you know, these people did this, but they haven't looked at this, and then B and C, and then maybe at the end of the background, you can also reiterate the objective, right? But yeah, you need to have a flow. Again, it goes back to telling a story, right? When there are two sections, but they have to be linked somehow, and there shouldn't be an abrupt break in your manuscript or in your chain of logic where a person reading, oh, this is starting a completely different thing. The story should flow smoothly.
Okay, doctor. Thank you for your explanations, and I appreciate your kind response about my
Yes,
questions.
of course, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. It has been very, very helpful. And my question is, if I'm actually writing a paper and I have to write a lot of equations that actually use standard symbols, do I still have to cite the equations that I'm using?
If they are equations which are based on common knowledge, so for example, fundamental equations, you don't have to cite them. If they are correlations, so for example, someone else measured the experimental data and they developed this equation, you have to cite the person who developed this equation, right? But if you're using F equals ma, for example, you don't need to cite Newton. It is fundamental knowledge.
All right, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so thank you all for being here, for listening. Again, if you have any questions, you just feel free to contact me. My email is ombasha@ncat.edu. I'll be sending the slides to Miss Ayana Boyd-Williams, and I'll also tell her to send you some information on how to access EndNotes and Mendeley, which are the citation management systems. Again, thank you so much, and see you around.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.